Hello, and welcome to David Starkey Talks. Today, I suppose, is, well, sort of the end of Boris Johnson, or perhaps indeed it's just the end of the beginning. He, after all, ended his last Prime Minister's Question Time with hasta la vista, Arnold Schwarzenegger and whatever. But he's sort of buried, isn't he? He has resigned. The number of candidates to succeed him has now been whittled down to two, to Rishi Sunak and to Liz Truss. And I suppose as that final act of hypocrisy, Tory MPs having defenestrated him, cheer him to the rafters, and the Labour Party behaving with its typical generosity of spirit, sat on its hands and in certain cases hurled insults. But there we are. So a day to deliver a kind of verdict, at least a first verdict of history, which is all contemporary history, like good journalism, can do. It's a first verdict, a kind of set of notes. Well, in the Times today, we had Daniel Finkelstein, their leading political columnist, trying to do just that. I thought actually, to be honest, it was a very bad piece. First thing that struck you about it, there wasn't a single fact. There were lots of assertions. The assertions were all superlatives, that's to say, superlatively bad. Boris was the worst prime minister. He was the most dishonest. He had inflicted the most extreme damage on the British structure of government, which indeed had barely survived the experience. Now, this kind of extremism seems to me to be not a good point at which to start. It's not that I'm particularly defending Boris at all. I just want to understand, we're a very old structure of government, one way or another. We've gone on for about 700 years, possibly a little bit longer, in recognisably similar patterns. We've had the office of Premier now for pushing whatever it is, pushing from 1720 to now. So we're looking at 1820, 1920, 2020. We're looking at 300 years of the office of Prime Minister. We've also got the kind of typical things that say about politicians. One of my favourite commonplaces, and commonplaces have got a lot to be said for them. They're common because actually they deal with common things. One of the commonplaces about politicians, and British politicians in particular, is that they fall into one of two categories. They're either a bishop, Tony Blair was clearly a bishop, or they're a bookie. Boris Johnson is clearly a bookie. Macmillan was a very much upper-class bookie, and so on. Right? You get the kind of general pattern. And Gordon Brown, of course, a kind of ultra-bishop, or rather a Presbyterian elder, or maybe even a general moderator of the Church of Labour. Very, 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 very bishop-like. Boris, obviously, very, very bookie-like. But I think we can go a little bit further. I think we can also, I made the point now, the business of commonplace. That's to say, things happen. Things happen quite frequently. Well, we've really had a bit of a clue, haven't we, that what's going on now isn't actually at all unprecedented. Have you noticed a date's been, not that people are really aware of it as a date, but a date has been floating around over the past few weeks of the as the MPs, who in their 5 votes, have whittled down the number of candidates to the 2 who go forward to the membership. Who has been organising it? Who has been solemnly reading out in committee room, whichever it is, the result? Well, a man called Sir Graham Brady. And who is he? Well, he is the chairman of the 1922 committee. Why 1922? And have you noticed, really interesting, isn't it? It's exactly 100 years ago. 2022 now, 1922 then. Why was a committee named after a year? Well, isn't it interesting? 100 years ago, a prime minister fell. He fell by means of a backbench revolt and the ensuing election, after which he never returned to power. The ensuing election led to the return in November, December of that year, led to the return of obviously a new parliament, the 1922 parliament, and what? The committee was named, the new backbench committee was named the 1922 committee, and it's acted as a kind of principal custodian of the Tory flame ever since, alongside the institutions like the Carlton Club, of course a much older foundation, to the beginning of the 19th century. The Carlton Club were, of course, Pincher by name and Pincher by nature did his pinching, and then the machinery of central office, which is again older than the 1922 committee and really goes back to the days of Disraeli and the aftermath of 1867 and so on. Anyway, so the central machinery of the party. The Prime Minister in 1922, the Prime Minister who fell, like Boris Johnson, as a result of a backbench rebellion. Who was he? See if you recognise the following description. And think, as I read it, am I talking about Boris, or am I talking about somebody else? It's by A.J.P. Taylor, a wonderful stylist. So it begins. He had no friends and did not deserve any. He repaid loyalty with disloyalty. He was surrounded by dependents and sycophants whom he rewarded lavishly and threw aside when they had served their turn. His rule was dynamic and sordid at the same time. He himself gave hostages to fortune by the irregularity of his private life. But essentially, his devious methods sprang from his nature. He could do things no other way. Look at that. No friends and didn't deserve any. His rule was dynamic and sordid at the same time. He gave hostages to fortune by the irregularity of his private life. Well, apart from the fact that A.J.P. Taylor's been dead several decades, that could have been written, couldn't it, about Boris Johnson. Instead, it's written about David Lloyd George. See, I think this takes us to the heart of the issue that we're now dealing with. Everybody's been talking as though Boris was simply a kind of sport of nature. Well, he is a bit of a sport of nature, this odd, singular man. But there's also the question of the times. Because I don't mean the Times newspaper where Finkelstein's article appeared. I mean the Times as 1922, 2022. It seems to me that the reason why this extraordinary parallel character of David Lloyd George and Boris Johnson has appeared at an interval of 100 and odd years is because there are similar circumstances. And this, I think, takes us into much deeper waters, into much more serious judgment than the kind of, Finkelstein, dreadful man, you've done terrible things, British Constitution scarcely survived. It reminds me of a very much more serious thinker than Mr. Finkelstein, which is, I don't often say his name with reverence, but one should. He is a very serious thinker, Karl Marx. Karl Marx comes up, and you'll be familiar with it, even if you don't know it's Karl Marx. You probably do anyway. My turn to stop being patronising. History happens twice, first as tragedy and then as farce. That's Karl Marx. Who's he writing about? What circumstances is he writing about? Well, he's writing about the two Napoleons, the great Napoleon, who emerged at the crisis of the French Revolution, Napoleon I, and the little Napoleon, Napoleon III, who emerges in the crisis of 1830 in France and makes himself first, only the French could do it, Prince President, Prince Président, and then emerges as the Emperor Napoleon III in the Third Empire. And the tragedy, the grandiosity, terror, the nobility, everything, it's the first Napoleon, the farce, the little Napoleon, Napoleon III. And I think, But what Marx is saying is that there's a significant gap of personality. In fact, there's a very great gap of personality between Napoleon III and Napoleon I. But that the circumstances, as well as the names, there's a kind of parallelism which enables events to echo, not obviously to repeat, but though they're very considerable elements of repetition, but essentially to echo across that gap of time. And I think that the way to understand Boris and before him David Lloyd George is to look at those echoes, to look at those circumstances which echo. And of course, in the case of Napoleon I and in the case of Napoleon III, the parallel circumstance is revolution. What is the parallel circumstance with David Lloyd George and Boris? Well, David Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister in 1916 at the absolute depths of the First World War, when, as he himself said, we're going to lose this war. So he emerges at a moment of huge, genuine crisis in warfare. Okay? Now, obviously, we are not in a war. Well, Boris, as you've seen, to not I think put it too unkindly, has milked somebody else's war. He's milked the Ukrainian war, I think for good motives, and has strutted on the world stage, as Thatcher tried to do, as every prime minister tries to do. It makes absolutely no difference, really, to their reputation at home, even though perhaps it should. But clearly, there was no war, or was there? See, I think, this is what I think we've got to start to understand, I think that, in fact, Boris has experienced not simply one war, he's experienced two. Clearly, it wasn't the First World War, but the circumstances are in which he succeeded to the premiership in the aftermath of Theresa May, in the aftermath of those several months, years actually, in which Parliament, led by John Bercow, and a series of Tory MPs, and of course the whole of the opposition, and the BBC, and the Guardian, and the universities, and everybody else tried to block the verdict of the referendum. If you will remember, our politics had frozen for nearly 24 months. We were on the point of a kind of national nervous breakdown. Nothing could be done. Nothing could be decided. There was simply this politics of stasis, this politics of stalemate in Britain and without, in terms of our relations with the European Union. And that seems to me to be a genuine emergency situation. And indeed, the resemblances to 1916 are really pretty great indeed, because of course, for David Lloyd George to become Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, had to be gotten rid of. And Asquith had been a very, very distinguished, unlike Theresa May, he'd been a very distinguished peacetime Prime Minister. He turned out to be a disastrous wartime Prime Minister, in the same way that May turned out to be a disastrous Prime Minister, full stop. But there were still loyalists. So in other words, you needed somebody who was capable of A, carrying out a coup, and then once that coup had actually happened, cutting the Gordian knot of the whole parliamentary resistance to Brexit, defeating the Speaker, Bercow, defeating people like the leading Tory Remainer. In many ways, I think the intelligence behind all that, Dominic Grieve and so on, you actually, they were all trying to reenact the role of the Long Parliament in its resistance to Charles I in the early stages of the in the early stages of the Civil War. All of that, you had to cut that knot. And then, of course, you had to cut another knot in the negotiations with the EU. In other words, what you needed was somebody capable, willing to carry out a coup, and then to do the unthinkable and the unsayable, and to force it through. You needed, in other words, a disruptor. And when David Lloyd George came to the end of his innings, like Boris Johnson, exactly 100 years ago in 1922, the man who was going to succeed him, Stanley Baldwin, uses exactly that word. He calls him a disruptor and points out that disruptors can be useful, he'd been useful in war, but can be deadly dangerous. So that's the first war of Boris Johnson. But you see, I think also COVID produced a second war, in fact, a much nearer parallel to war than even the aftermath of, well, cutting the Gordian knot of Brexit. It did so, of course, not because of the disease itself, which I persist in banging on is actually comparatively mild. You know, everybody's talked about 200,000 people dying with COVID now over 2 years. Can I gently remind everybody, 500,000 people die every year. 1,500 die every day. 10,000 die every week. So, yeah, a few extra deaths, but nothing terrible. But the thing that was terrible, of course, was the way we decided to react. Again, I've talked about this, the extraordinary panic that having seized governments in China, and again, I came up with the phrase, get a Chinese virus, finish with a Chinese society, that first decision of China to lock down, and then spreading through Europe, I think beginning with Italy and then through France, Spain, the decision to replicate lockdown, that thing that is absolutely hostile to, I talked about the hundreds of years of English, British government, anything more fundamentally hostile to that notion than lockdown couldn't be thought of. But over the weekend of the 12th, 13th, 14th March 2020, that decision was taken. And what it does, we now need to recognise it. And it will be the problem that Boris's successor deals with. What we did, we decided to adopt measures that are analogous to those of total war. And indeed, in many ways, more extreme in terms of their impact on domestic life within Britain than either of the two world wars, and at a comparable cost. In other words, we inflicted on ourselves a wartime situation, exactly the extraordinary circumstances in which David Lloyd George had risen in that first period of his disruption. So I'm arguing then that these two strange, odd, peculiar circumstances. You've got no friends. He doesn't deserve any. His rule is both dynamic and sordid. And the extraordinary regularity of private life. Well, we all know about Boris Johnson's private life. You know, he has scattered marriages and mistresses and offspring on either side of the blanket, you know, around with glad abandon. David Lloyd George, it's different, but still profoundly shocking, especially for 100 years ago. He's got a wife in Wales. He's got a long-term mistress, Frances Stevenson, in London, and in and between, whom he eventually marries after the death of his Welsh wife. So he keeps two separate households, a London household and a Welsh household. And he amuses himself with the wives of leading Liberal politicians because here again there's a very big difference with Boris. Lloyd George was neat, very tidy, elegant man, magical, of course, with rather soft, longish hair, very fashionable in the Edwardian period, which was beautifully groomed and tender hands. The ladies adored it. Anyway, so two men then, this extraordinary irregularity and, of course, the whiff of scandal about both of them. With Boris, well, it's primarily the scandal of Partygate. With David Lloyd George, the instrument of corruption, the sale of offices that permeates. Well, it was characteristic of Liberal politics. They didn't have the amount of money which in those days the Tories could actually command, and one easy way of doing it was by selling knighthoods and peerage titles and so on. And it had always been there, but under the regime of David Lloyd George, it intensifies. Those involved become shadier and shadier, and although the fund is supposedly available for political activities, it increasingly passes into the hands of Lloyd George himself, and although it's not proved finally, it seems that quite a large part entered directly into his personal finances, and when he'd sold a newspaper group, which he'd used to set it up and used to invest in, and when he sells it, he makes a very large fortune indeed. So real corruption. I think of a much more serious type than, Boris with Partygate, elaborate wallpapers and all that sort of thing. So these two men are highly irregular in their personal lives, irregular sexually, irregular in terms of their conduct, their peculiar fondness for going roundabout, but both called into power in circumstances that are utterly extraordinary, are those of war, or what I would regard as quasi-war. So I'm positing then a particular kind of circumstance that calls for a particular kind of character. And here again, you see, this is also, isn't it striking, Boris, as we all know, aspires to be Churchill. Indeed, his farewell present from the cabinet was an edition of Churchill's, a very fine edition, I think the first edition, a handsome leather-bound edition of Churchill's history of the Second World War. And Churchill says, famously, he will be confident of the verdict of history because he will write it. But of course, Boris, Churchill, well, we all know Boris fancies himself as Churchill. And Churchill again was a disruptor, a man, who crosses the floor of the House twice from between Labour and Conservative, a man who, again, is in many ways, well, not in many ways, is absolutely outside his party's leadership for the period from the late 20s right through the 1930s, is hostile to the principle, profoundly hostile to the principal thrust of government policy, which we nowadays call appeasement, and so on, and is called upon deliberately as an outsider. Again, Stanley Baldwin, the man that I've referred to already, with his verdict on David Lloyd George as a disruptor, he produces a very similar verdict on Churchill. He sort of says effectively, we are keeping him warm. If we have a war, he will be a war leader. In other words, he's not a politician for ordinary times. He's a politician for extreme times. But then, of course, there is that equally extreme gap of character between Boris and Churchill. For all Boris is fantasizing that he's Churchill, it is in fact clear that as everything that I'm saying now, the detailed description that I'm giving now, that marvelous character sketch by A.J.P. Taylor, it's clear that the character that Boris resembles as the farce to the original tragedy is David Lloyd George. It's not Churchill. But so we've talked about character and we've talked about big overall sets of circumstances. Let's sort of pull the thing together now by finishing it off and doing something else and talking about what they actually do. Now, here again, it's very important. I've used the Marxist formula, David Lloyd George as tragedy, Boris as farce. In other words, Lloyd George is 1,000 times more impressive than Boris. The same character flaws, much of the same style, the same slipperiness, but the achievement is of a completely different order. He was already a politician of the first rank when he becomes prime minister. He plays a leading part in the institution of the welfare state in Britain, the first welfare state, not the welfare state created by Labour in 1945, but the welfare state that's created by the Liberals from 1906 onwards. Because again, you must remember the welfare state of 45, the concepts of it are essentially liberal. They are not Labour. That's to say, the idea of national insurance is Beveridge. Beveridge is a liberal. The institutions most of the institutions that are created, the grant-giving bodies, like the Arts Council, the University Grants Commission, so much financial management, that's all the work of John Maynard Keynes, who is another liberal. So there is this profound liberal tradition tradition of social liberalism, whose Ark of the Covenant, whose standard bearer is Lloyd George. And Lloyd George is also a supremely great wartime prime minister. He doesn't have the flamboyant courage of Churchill. In fact, he very often harbours lots and lots of doubts. But he finally, when push comes to shove, he has the courage to take the right decision. So I'm sorry, Boris, although he did indeed sort of he certainly got rid of Theresa May, he sort of got Brexit done. He is not a politician of at all the first rank. I'm really comparing circumstance with character. But I'm also, as I said, I'm going to compare the machinery of government and the changes in the machinery of government. This is the point that many people have made, that Finkelstein has made and so on, and people talk, with solemn expressions on their faces. Oh dear, our government has become much more presidential, much more like the government of the United States, and this is a bad thing, and this is completely unprecedented. Well, the answer is, well, it may be a bad thing, but it certainly isn't unprecedented, because again, the government of David Lloyd George in the First World War was described exactly by A.J.P. Taylor in exactly those terms as being like the government of an American president. We have been here before because the circumstances demanded it. And it's much more. I mean, I accuse Finkelstein of having no facts. Let's put some really hard, concrete facts there. The demands of government in the First World War, that huge crisis, the crisis of the management of the domestic economy, the terrible problems of food supply and supply of munitions, because of course most things had to be imported by sea, and although the German fleet is neutralized, the German U-boats and their absolute indiscriminate attacks on shipping that threaten supplies in a terrible kind of way, the need for the coordination of government and the concentration of power at the centre. How was it done? Well, it was done in a fashion that directly echoes what happens with the cabinet, both with Brexit, the heart of government, both with Brexit and more particularly with COVID. The key thing that happens from 1916 onwards is that the cabinet, that group of 20 odd, meeting once a week, at that point not even keeping proper minutes, suddenly becomes a war cabinet. A war cabinet of 5 people apart from the Prime Minister. The individuals in it are not ordinary politicians at all. They are the great in 1916, 17, 18, they are the great imperialists, particularly. They are Curzon and they are Milner, and Henderson for the Labour Party, and so on. You get this war cabinet meeting daily, and not simply talking, but acting, overseeing, acting exactly the kind of complex of the inner committee, the inner cabinet that operated during both Brexit and more particularly during COVID, where you get a handful of ministers actually running things. Of course, you need a proper secretariat to do that. And in 1916-17, a new powerful secretariat emerges to service the new war cabinet. And do you know what it is? It becomes the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office, whose antics, of course, form the backbone of Partygate. I've talked about them before. The wonderful business of the head of propriety and ethics, Helen McNamara, being the person who supplied the karaoke machine for the party in the Cabinet Secretary's office the day before Boris Johnson's, morsel of birthday cake party that got both him and, to his absolute outrage, Rishi Sunak fined. Again, the head of the COVID task force, also fined for operating another drunken party in December of 2020. These are members of the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office emerges to service the war cabinet of the First World War. The functioning of the Cabinet Office during Partygate, as the whole business of Partygate demonstrates, hasn't been particularly impressive. That is putting it very, very mildly indeed. In the period of 1916 to 1918, it was very impressive indeed, because it was run by a man called Sir Maurice Hankey, and he really creates this machinery of the inner civil service, which of course becomes the core, as it remains, of a Prime Minister's department. More than that, because you're dealing with things like the control of food supply and the business of munitions and so on, what does the government do? Well, the government does exactly what the government did in the circumstances from March 2020 onwards, with the beginning of the COVID crisis. Do you remember those contracts to get desperately needed supplies of PPE, of personal protective equipment? What did you do? You went to a great bunch of businessmen, some of them a little bit like that, some rather better, some bigger, some effective, some not. You did exactly the same thing in the First World War, as the government has to take control of the domestic economy, of the running of everyday life in circumstances of either war or pseudo-war, the pseudo-war of the COVID lockdown. And you use exactly the same kind of people. You use businessmen, businesswomen, of course, in the period of 2020, in 1916, of course, businessmen only, who were actually used to doing things, who were used to running big organizations, who were used literally to delivering goods. So a small cabinet, a war cabinet, a COVID cabinet, the creation of the cabinet office actually to run things with a powerful cabinet secretary, the use of businessmen actually to run task forces and all the rest, specific things for the specific jobs which government doesn't normally have to do, like procuring vast supplies of PPE when it's in extremely short demand. And then finally, there's an even more striking resemblance. Both, you will remember, Boris and well, you may not remember with David Lloyd George, they both had a huge stroke of luck. The thing that saved us from the perpetuation of lockdown, which China is still going on in New Zealand, they are going back to it, was vaccination. And if you remember, vaccination came about as effectively another one of the, not effectively, as a result of another one of these special task forces, and that under Kate Bingham, now Dame Kate Bingham, and they pulled out of the hat a vaccine. Well, in the First World War, the equivalent was the realization that you could defeat the U-boats by a system of convoys, done in exactly the same way from outside the system. Bingham, of course, you were completely outside the system, brought in, given virtually absolute powers by direct delegation from the Prime Minister. Similarly, the circumstances which led over the dead body of the Admiralty. The Admiralty declared loudly that having convoys would make no difference, that that wasn't the way to deal with U-boats and all the rest. Of course, convoys was, and convoys really saved the war and kept us afloat long enough for the enormous resources that came in on the Allied side with the accession of America under Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, to the Allied side to have their effect against Germany and to bring about German defeat. But so there was a similar stroke of luck from one of these left field figures. Are you seeing the absolutely astonishing parallels? The parallels really, really are astonishing. These two disruptors operating special modes of government which are suitable for crisis, suitable for extreme crises. And then, of course, they do continue to behave a little bit like that when the extreme crisis goes. That's the problem. The disruptor doesn't know when to stop disrupting. And that's pretty much what happened with Lloyd George. It's pretty much what happened with Boris Johnson, except I haven't really filled in, again, this question of big picture. I've emphasized the similarity of war, similarity of real war, the real war of the First World War, and pseudo-war, the kind of simulated war of our extreme reaction to COVID, the lockdown, furlough, getting everybody used to doing bugger all and being paid for it and working from home, and so on. All of these catastrophic things. Well, what is the aftermath of war? Well, the aftermath of war is soaring inflation and sky-high taxes. And that's exactly what the position was after the First World War, and exactly what the position is now. There's a final point of comparison, which is the last phase of both Johnson and of David Lloyd George. Johnson, and I've talked about this quite a lot, Johnson's electoral victory in December 2019 was a very remarkable one. I've described how it was a kind of coalition. It was the coalition which Disraeli pioneered after the 1867 Reform Act of the respectable, patriotic northern working man with the cosy South, with the more typical Tory electorate of the South. It was that sort of coalition which Boris managed in particular circumstances and with his particular personality to revive. Well, when David Lloyd George, who had become, just like Boris, Prime Minister without a general election, he succeeds by an internal coup against Asquith. When Lloyd George stands for re-election, and there's a fresh election in the end of after the armistice of 1918, there's an immediate general election in December 1918. The Liberal Party splits. Lloyd George's Liberal Party splits, with one bit of it led by Lloyd George and the other bit of it led by Asquith, who, like Theresa May, had never forgiven the man who'd replaced him. So there is this sulking Asquith as leader of the largest faction of the Liberals. And the Liberals do very badly in that election. So how on earth does Lloyd George remain Prime Minister? He does because there was a coalition. There's what was called the coupon, and that was an agreement between Lloyd George supporting Liberals and the Conservative Party not to run against each other and to endorse each other's candidates. And between them, the Lloyd George rump of the Liberal Party and the Tory Party, led by Bonar Law, enjoy a huge majority. So another, just like Boris, in 2019, in fact, it's a much bigger majority than 80. So you get these two enormous majorities. And again, people say, do you remember Boris? Oh, I'm going to go on for 10 years. I'll go on for longer than Thatcher. I have the largest Tory majority since Thatcher. Well, what did people say about David Lloyd George in December 1918? 1918, sorry. He can be Prime Minister for as long as he likes. That's actually the verdict of Bonar Law. He's Prime Minister for life if he wants it. And people actually use terms like, just to really drive this point home, dictator. Balfour, A.J. Balfour. He's the man, Bob's your uncle. He's the man who'd been Prime Minister, largely, it is said, because he was the nephew of Lord Salisbury and remains a very important figure in government, mainly as Foreign Secretary. He again uses this phrase about David Lloyd George, that he's a dictator. The dictator in terms of war, as indeed, Boris, driven by Cummings, was for stretches of time effectively enjoying the powers of a dictator. The problem is, of course, once the emergency goes, that behaviour becomes intolerable, and it becomes especially intolerable when, in the case of both of them, it's combined with scandal, with Partygate, with the sale of offices, with £100 rolls of wallpaper, with, well, certainly in Boris's case, a politically active wife whom I label as Canny Boleyn. All of those things, together with the fundamental irregularity of their characters, irregular characters, extraordinary characters, is fine for irregular and extraordinary times, but not for every day. So I think we can begin to form a much more nuanced, a much more serious impression of Boris, of why he was there, why he was elected, why he was chosen. The British people and the Tory party weren't stupid. This wasn't, as so many of the Remainer liberal elites are trying to say, some moderate, monstrous case of populism. It was necessary. It's necessary in those extraordinary circumstances. But thank heavens, it's only necessary then, and as we've seen, with the really very painless process, it took a bit of time, but the painless process of Boris's removal, the ordinary patterns and structures and that kind of tensile spring of our constitution, despite all the damage, the careless, foolish damage done to it by Tony Blair and the liberal elites in the 1990s, it worked. He's gone. He may come back, but he'll have to come back only according to the rules. The disruptor, whether he's called David Lloyd George or whether he's called Boris Johnson, or even if he's called Churchill, look at the end of Churchill after the First World War, after the Second World War. Circumstances go that extraordinary character no longer answers to the need of now ordinary or ordinary-ish times. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.